Hello and welcome to Rauta's classic album reviews. This time we're talking about Ulver debut album Bergtatt that was released early in the 90s. Now, when Ulver is discussed in general among metal people, it is often recognized as one of those first wave of Norwegian black metal bands, that is, technically speaking, second wave in general, of course. And Ulver is often mentioned as one of the most important bands when it comes to that, because early in their career they indeed did black metal before they ventured into more electronic music and all that stuff. What is worth mentioning though, that there is only like 2 real metal albums by Ulver, and even they are different from one another. What is more curious is that Ulver being listed as a black metal band is almost like talking about Darkthrone as a death metal band. I mean, technically speaking, Darkthrone did one pure death metal album before moving on to black metal and other styles, as much as Ulver did only one like black folk album before moving on. Later on they came back with black metal though, but talking about Ulver as metal band or black metal band is somewhat far-fetched. Maybe it's more telling about the limitations or limited view on the band itself rather than about the band. Ulver has always been in constant motion. Whether we're talking about the first album that pretty much created this nature-driven or nature-oriented black folk album, Bergtatt, or the other ones that came after that, it's clear that the band has always kept indeed in itself in motion, shifting from black metal to more folkier tunes and coming back to black metal and then moving on with electronic music in various fashions. It has been constantly shifting from one shape to another. It's indeed a shape-shifting band for both good and bad. Now let's talk about the Bergtatt, the album in question of today. But before, it's worth mentioning what other people have been thinking of the album when it comes to ratings. Now, the first clue is, of course, to check out Metal Archives. I mean, that is pretty much where metal people will rate their albums and all that stuff. A quick look at Metal Archives' discography on Ulver, which is, by the way, quite vast, the discography that is, gives you a little bit of indication what's going on. From 5%, which seems like pure hate to me, we go all the back to 93, but 22 reviews for Bergtatt. Clearly the highest rated album by the band. Seems like an insult to me if you really ask. I know there's a lot of people who actually like albums like Perdition City or themes from William Blake's album, and even albums after that. But it seems like, of course, when you're talking about Metal Archives, it's kind of evident that the first albums, which are metal ones, are more liked. However, there is not that big of a difference between Perdition City 88 to Natas Madrigal 87. However, these numbers are relatively small, of course. We're talking about a dozen of people, or at least maximum of 2 dozens, basically. So let's tune for radio music side, which is more about ratings in terms of giving more bigger spectrum of how things are rated. The same thing is pretty much here. Of course, the average rating is lower because where Metal Archives, most of the reviews are written by fans or haters for that matter. You see the polar opposites more often than the mediocrity. Here, however, compared to the over 90%, we have the best album rated less than 3.9, which is, of course, a very, very good score. I mean, it's almost 9 out of 5. 4 out of 9, which technically would be something like almost 80% on average. That being said, Bergtatt is clearly the only one closer to 4 on average. The rest, well, Natas Madrigal is almost 3.75, so quite close after all. And Perdition City, once again, the same thing. But the down you go to the list, it starts to shift towards 3.5 and less. Well, even the Scary Music is getting lower scores here as well as Metal Archives, but not as brutal. Like I said, Metal Archives is more about solar opposites, polar opposites that is. But here we are talking about Bergtatt, not so much the other stuff. So let's tune it back for Metal Archives site and open the tab for Ulver debut album coming out in 1995, 2 years after the band originally was founded. And this album constitutes of, or made of 5 different songs titled Kapitel from 1 to 5, with then individual titles like Trull skog faren vild or Solen går bak asen ner. No, I'm not Norwegian, so my pronunciation is definitely a bit off, but you get the idea. So 34 minutes of an album with 5 songs, more on the lengthier side except for the track number 4, and the style is very, very warm. Now, one could even make the statement that Ulver doesn't really sound too much black metal on this album. Okay, that's a bit revisionist statement. Let me elaborate on that after taking a sip of coffee. Now, if we take a look at nowadays black metal, there are lots of bands who operate along the lines of Ulver debut. Warm, atmospheric, beautiful even, clean vocals and all that stuff. Now, a lot more purist people might say, has nothing to do with black metal. Why so? First of all, not so much as a satanic album. Yeah. Has more clean vocals, almost at least, than the raspier, screamer ones. Kind of a good point. It's almost like too soft, too beautiful for a black metal album, as opposed to grim, raw, violent, warlike and all that stuff. So coming from more on the war metal side, people who want more extreme in the terms of metal music, well, Ulver surely didn't do an extreme metal album at all when we're talking about Bergtatt. Surely the most extreme parts are the raspy vocals, which are, by the way, great in my opinion. But apart from that, especially if you take a look at the first track, the Trull skog faren vild, pure clean vocals. It's more like folkier metal song. One could even say it's closer to bands like Catatonia and the stuff like with really nice, beautiful sung vocals. But they're all clean. They're all nice and all that stuff. Even the riffs are very smooth and beautiful and, well, atmospheric, melodic and touchy. They have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with more traditional take on black metal. And what traditional black metal might mean in this context, whether we are talking about bands like Marduk, or Dark Throne, or Burzum, or Bathory, Celifrost, Venom, doesn't really matter. Impel Nazarene, Berit, Archgoat, get the idea. They are all way more raw, violent, grim, evil, dark, whatever words you want to use. All of our songs, half of it anyway, on this album don't really resonate with that. So what makes this black metal album to begin with? Well, certainly some riffs are outright black metal. There are parts where it goes really fast. I think this Kapitel number 3 is a good example of that. Mind you, there's an interesting anecdote. Gravlig blev hun var. I mean, there are parts where it just goes blast beat and then there's this big sound in the middle of the song and everything is like okay. It's like opposite of the first track. Everything here is actually like running bull coming to you, ready to crush your bones and all that stuff. It's going to be really, really violent and almost like totally different band than the first track. And talking about this funny anecdote, around, I think it's roughly 3 minutes or so, 3 minutes, 10 seconds, something like that. I noticed now for the first time actually when I was listening this for a few times before making this album, because there has been so many years before, since my previous listens of this album, already got in the late 90s, I think, maybe mid to late 90s. And throughout the years, of course, I've listened this to many times. But now, since the last time, probably over 10 years, only to come back to revisit this for this particular classic review. And only now I kind of noticed how much the tempo drops around 3 minutes. I actually had to ask a couple of my drumming friends, like, am I just imagining these things, or does it seem like the blast beats is like really hard only to kind of wear down a little bit? And also the volume drops a little bit. My drummer friends said it's about maybe 10 beats per minute drop, so it's not that big, but it's noticeable, especially if you're a drummer. So it's kind of a weird why they decided to keep it there, because it's something that a lot of musicians would say a clear mistake. I mean, you kind of do it so hard only to drop like that. This is exaggeration, but you get the point. Other than that, this album almost feels like a flawless entity. However, there are parts where it's, get to the I think it's track number 4, where it sounds like it's just, people walking in the forest or something. So it's like, stick snapping or whatever, which is not neither metal nor folk stuff. Not black metal, at least, for sure. And this album, towards the end, it's kind of starts on decline. So the point here is, much like Burzum Philosophem album, this album starts really powerful ways. Both the first track and the second track, which are different. I mean, there's this really nice clean vocals song, which, like I said, doesn't really sound like black metal one, but it's still a great one. And then this more black metal like approach, especially tracks number 2 and 3. They're really great and powerful, and then it drops. So if this had been a 3-song MCD, this would have been really, really great in my opinion. I'm not saying tracks number 4 or 5 are bad by no means, but they are not on the same level as the first 3 tracks, especially the 2 first ones. So much like Burzum's Philosophem, which has absolutely the best Burzum material out there, the rest of the album, not so much. It's good, but it's not great. And the same thing is the problem, for me anyway, with Bergtatt. So don't get me wrong, I think this is a good album, definitely a good album, but great? No. And that's why I actually sold it many, many years ago. So for me, this is an 8 out of 10 album. So definitely good, and I totally understand why some people would rate it like 90% or beyond that. But for me, it doesn't really do that trick. However, all this being said, from the minor mistakes and weird parts along the ways, I can totally understand why this album is so much of an impact to the whole genre. Not only black metal, but of course the bands that wanted to operate with clean vocals and go beyond the grim blackness. And probably this was their, excuse. Ulver did it okay. We can also include clean vocals. We can go to the forest and record ourselves walking in the woods. And we can go soft. We can have all those beautiful melodies. And nobody's going to hang us anymore. I mean, mind you, back in the 90s, I remember these statements. I think it was Marduk's maybe Opus Nocturna album, which said like, no keyboards, no clean vocals. It was a strong statement against albums such as this. Like, we're not a bunch of pushes doing that kind of stuff. We're grim, we're manly, we're masculine, we're about war. And then there's these guys like, hey, what about soft vocals? What about soft-spoken parts and beautiful melodies? Fuck those beautiful melodies. This is grim music for grim people. So you get the idea. Burzum and the bands like that, which are partly very, very atmospheric, but also very grim in their song and even somewhat raw, fall in the middle. They probably get like, okay, but Burzum albums, yeah, they're great. They're not Dark Throne grim. Not to mention more raw end of black metal. But also, talking about Ulver debut album, it's very, very different. However, like I said, I'm getting rambling too much. I just wanted to talk about, this was lately mentioned to me from a couple of different sources. One interview I read about one of the early Ulver members who actually started doing acoustic guitar, the Harvard project. But also because some people were talking about this album and I felt like, yeah, it's been so many years, I need to revisit that album and make it into a classic review. Why so? Because in my opinion, it totally deserves the recognition. In my opinion, it totally deserves the time to listen to that and let it sink in your head the same way as it's sinking in my head. Well, throughout the decades anyway. So once again, a good album, not great, but definitely worth listening once again. Interesting release, and one can only say, too bad this style didn't last for longer than that. For a debut album, this is exceptional, and unfortunately they didn't take it to the next level. We can only imagine what could it have been. This is Rauta. Looking forward to your comments, questions, notes, whatever, in the comments box section. See you, and bye-bye.